I think we'll continue so we stay on time. I'm going to go ahead and act as MC for the next couple of talks. We have Walt Koeing, who has spent most of his career at the Hastings Preserve down in Carmel Valley, a UC facility, a wonderful place. But now he's actually back at Cornell. He's one of them good guys that went with his wife when she got a great job. Though he must still have his great job too, because he's still an adjunct professor at UC Berkeley. His sort of claim to fame is he's probably done longer term research on acorn production than anyone else. He's been out there for at least 25 years collecting them, and he knows everything about acorn woodpeckers. So if you have an interest in that species, this is the man to ask. He's written a book on that subject, I do believe. So, Walt Koeing. Oh. I didn't know where he's going.
I'll stick it here somewhere. That was good. There you go. Did you turn this on? Yeah.
Remote goes off USB.
Oh,
do you need that?
Okay. Sure. There. Next one.
Walt, what's the name of your Acorn Woodpecker book?
It's old. You don't want my old Acorn Woodpecker book. I got to write a new one of these days. So. All right.
We're going to be out.
That's a good question. Okay, hold on here. Let me just get... Yes, I know that is true. Okay, let's... introduction. Cancel. Heavens. No, we don't want to... Great. Don't identify it. We don't care. All right. We'll be here in a minute, but I think, assuming something happens. Okay, are we going to... It's a pleasure to be here. I'm actually not an adjunct professor anymore, but Doug will appreciate this. I'm a research zoologist emeritus at the University of California, Berkeley. So I'm very proud of that. But Doug's told you all about growing those acorns, which is really pretty interesting. I'm interested in a lot of these same questions about the selective effects of acorn size and so on. But really what I've gotten interested in is why are there so many, no, it's not why are there so many acorns, why aren't there more acorns out there? I mean, one of my mantras is you can never have too many acorns. And so it's a big question as to why some years, I'm sure you've noticed there are lots of acorns out there, and other years you can't find an acorn for the life of you. And so before I really get into this, I do want to mention that I'm going to be shifting back and forth a little bit between mostly blue oaks and valley oaks, but there are 9 species of oaks. I guess I do have a little bit of this. Is this going to work? What do I press?
Right arrow, which is
yes. Okay. I mean, there are 9 species of tree oaks in California, and they do not all produce acorns synchronously. And I'll talk a lot about synchrony as later on in the talk, but basically the issue gets into a lot of these questions, such as just was asked a minute ago, which I found really interesting, which is, if it's a bad acorn crop here, next fall, how far away do you have to go to start to find acorns? That's a question of what's called spatial synchrony, and it's the kind of thing that I got interested in some time ago. And as Doug mentioned, that is one of the things about oaks. Oaks live a long time, and so if you really want to study them, it's good to get going early in your career, because otherwise they do tend to outlive you and outlive anything you can sort of think about. Anyway, so what I'm going to talk about is acorn production. I've gotten interested in basically made it one of the goals of the rest of my career to do what I can to understand the patterns of acorn production in California oaks at pretty much as many levels as I can get at. And there are a lot of reasons to be interested in this. I mean, oaks are beautiful. They produce these beautiful landscapes such as you have here. You can't eat them, which is, of course, what the California Native Americans used to do. Over half the diet of some of the tribes of California Native Americans used to be made up of acorns. And for all of you who have ever tried to eat an acorn, you can just begin to appreciate what that must have been like. I mean, it's a lot of work. Not just to plant acorns, but if you're planning on eating them, then it's even worse, because you got to deal with all those nasty, chemicals that are in there. You got to leach them. You got to protect them from all these animals out there that want to eat them as well as you do. And it's an issue, and that's part of the difficulties they had to deal with. And of course, there are a lot of friends of the forest that like to eat acorns as well, and that's really how I got into it, because as Doug mentioned, I actually started out my career studying acorn woodpeckers and still do study acorn woodpeckers. And I don't know, it's something about their name that made me think that I bet acorns are probably important to these things. And it turns out they are, as a matter of fact. And I have a movie here which you are not going to see about acorn woodpeckers storing acorns. But of course, that's what they do. They harvest acorns off those oaks in the fall, and they store them in these spectacularly bird-made structures known as storage trees or granaries. And then these acorns become this incredibly important resource that's important to just about everything you can imagine about acorn woodpeckers. So I started studying acorn woodpeckers back as a grad student at Berkeley in the 70s, and it sounds like the title of the movie, doesn't it? Berkeley? Never mind. Okay. And it wasn't very long. It was several years into that we thought, we really got to start doing something about, getting data on the acorn crop, because the acorns are important. We know they're important. The woodpeckers did really well in good acorn years. They didn't seem to do so well in bad acorn years. And, I sort of, back in those heady days, I was a little naive and thought that the botanists would have their finger on the pulse of the California acorn crop and would know all about all this stuff. And I'll tell you, one of the things I've learned as a professional in this field is that if you want data on something, almost no matter how obvious it is, like how many acorns, why is there a good crop this year and not next year, or what does it take to grow acorns? Well, pretty much you got to go out there and do it yourself, because the odds of someone else having done it for you or doing it for you is remarkably low, even in a place like California, where there are a lot of people out there interested in a lot of interesting biological phenomena. All right, well, as I mentioned, acorns were really important to acorn woodpeckers, and this isn't a talk about acorn woodpeckers, but I will sort of mention that, when it's a really good acorn crop, the birds do store a lot of acorns, and survivorship is relatively high, and then the next spring, the birds just go crazy. In fact, acorn woodpeckers will even breed in the fall sometimes when it's a really good acorn crop. We've had nestlings fledge somewhere around Halloween, I believe, in a couple of years. So it's not real common, but it does happen. And so at some level, it's really kind of interesting, because ecologically, the year for acorn woodpeckers starts about August. And they have a short breeding season there in the fall, and then there's this long kind of hiatus over the winter until then they really get going again in the spring. But that's all driven by the fall acorn crop. All right, well, so it did take us a little while, but eventually we got out there and realized we were going to have to do something about measuring the acorn crop ourselves. And even then it sort of took us several years to really get into the swing of things. But back only about 30 years ago, we decided we would mark a bunch of trees and go out there and count the acorns. And actually this goes back to the first Oak Symposium down in Claremont in 1978, fall of 78, something like that, where, I won't go through this long story because I don't have that much time, but in any case, there was a talk by a guy at Cal Fish and Game who talked about measuring the acorn crop and how he did it visually, and so we took that and modified it a little bit. And so if you're wondering how you go about measuring the acorn crop, and well, there are a lot of different ways you can do it, and we in fact did start by putting out traps, which is what people tend to do in the East, and there are problems with that, lots of problems, and in the end we really wanted to be able to get data on a lot of trees. In fact, nowadays we count acorns, we measure the acorn crop on over 1,000 trees every fall in California, and the fact is, there's a limited amount of time you can do that, especially when you live in New York. So, in fact, we do it in a kind of quick and dirty way. Two of us go to each tree, and these are all marked trees. We have some here. Marked trees, we go there, and we each time each other and count with binoculars as many acorns as we can on different parts of the tree in 15 seconds. Okay? So each of us counts for 15 seconds. We add that up, and that's our measure for that tree. Okay? And I'll tell you right now, there are a few problems with that measure. It's not perfect, but it is quick, and it's pretty good. It's really good in terms of if you do it for a fair number of trees, 10 or 20 trees, in an area, it gives you a really good measure of what the kind of average acorn crop is for that area. It's not quite as good when it comes to, the crop for that individual tree, which is something we'd really like to know, but it's pretty good. And I won't go into all the details about that or justify it terribly much, but I'll tell you it's pretty good, and it's a heck of a lot better than any alternative that you're going to be able to come up with. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about the variability. I mean, this is sort of it's just one of these spectacular ecological phenomena out there that, some years there are just acorns everywhere and other years there aren't. And, it's just really important. It just drives a lot of stuff out there. There are these incredible pulses of food that are affecting wildlife out there in ways that, in fact, we know almost nothing about here, except in a couple of cases like the acorn woodpeckers that I just mentioned. All right, so these are just data from our surveys at Hastings, which is down in Monterey County, and that's where we started all this anyway. And so I haven't actually updated it in a couple of years, but it does go back to 1980. Oops, I just pressed the wrong thing. Could you press something again to... Okay. And just the point of this is the mean number of acorns we counted in 30 seconds on these trees. Now, if you're wondering, if you sit there and count, and we sort of have a standardized way we count, the most acorns you can count in 15 seconds is about 70. Okay, so if both of you are looking at a tree that is totally loaded with acorns and you're doing nothing but counting for 15 seconds, you end up with about 130, 140. Okay. So when you have over 60 acorns per tree, and this is over about 50 trees that we survey every year, it just means that pretty much every tree is loaded with acorns. Okay. Whereas other years, in 1986, did someone get elected president in never mind. Okay, 2001, 2003, I mean, these were really bad years, and there just weren't any, you really couldn't find an acorn at all out there. So, what's going on? Why, I don't want to, there are a lot of different levels you can look at this at. What I'm going to talk just quickly about and briefly is I'll say a little bit about this annual variability. There are other levels such as individual variability. I mean, any of you have gone out there and looked, you know that some trees seem to produce a lot of acorns, and other trees don't produce hardly any acorns at all, even in a good year. And that's really true. I mean, there is almost as much variability among individuals as there is across years. But the fact is, well, I can't really get into that because I don't have too much time. But I do want to mention a little bit about the annual variability and then talk a bit about geographic variability, and we can talk more about it later on if you like. All right, so the two things we've known for a fair length of time that allow you to say something predictive about what the acorn crop is going to be. And now I'm pretty much going to be talking about blue oaks and valley oaks, which do tend to produce acorns fairly synchronously. I mean, when it's a good year for valley oaks, it tends to be a good year for blue oaks as well. This does not extend to the other species, mind you, but I'm just going to be talking about them. They're relatively simple for reasons that I probably won't get into unless somebody asks, and then I'll just keep talking forever until Doug drags me off here. But anyway, so there are two factors that we know correlate with the acorn crop that I want to mention. The first is what they did last year. Okay, and if they had a really good crop last year, then odds are they aren't going to have such a good crop this year. And if they had a really bad crop last year, odds are they're going to tend to have a pretty good crop this year. So there's a negative correlation. It's called a negative temporal autocorrelation between what the trees do one year and what they do the next year. And I just want to mention that because it actually is very important biologically to what's going on here, because just the fact that you have this negative correlation tells us that, or at least it strongly suggests that what these trees are doing is that they're garnering resources, and when they have a really good acorn year, they're putting a lot of those resources out into producing this good crop, and then it takes them a while to be able to garner enough resources again to be able to do it again. So, and that's important because they just are not, I mean, they're doing more than just tracking some variable resource that's out there, like, a good rainfall year, they produce lots of acorns, a bad year, they don't produce acorns. No, they're doing more than that. This is really an evolutionarily interesting phenomenon where they're garnering these resources, putting them out disproportionately into reproduction some years, and then taking these trees a few years to get those resources again. Yeah?
I noticed in that previous graph that you had, there seem to be several bunches of successive good years.
Yeah. Well, right. It's not just that simple. Okay, there's a second factor at least, and it actually correlates even though you can't read that. There's a second factor which correlates even stronger with the acorn crop, which is what things are like in the spring. Right about now. And when April conditions are warm, which means it's dry in California, when it's basically warm and dry, you tend to have a good acorn crop for blue oaks and valley oaks. When it's not good, when it's cold and wet and rainy and crummy, you tend to have a bad acorn crop. And these two things are clearly interacting in some way. This is something you know because you know what they did the year before. This is basically a random variable that, you have nobody, including the trees, has any control over. And so, yeah, you can't really tell what it's going to be like this year based on what it's going to be, what it was last year, but, it at least gives you a beginning of an idea. And then conditions in the spring apparently are really important to determining that. Yeah?
Might it be that if you have a wet, cold April, it's knocking the pollen down?
Well, okay, we're getting into pollen. That's the next thing. Okay, so, this is sort of a long story. These are all wind-pollinated trees. Okay, and the idea of wind pollination, of course, they produce those nice catkins, which are out there, and there's pollen floating around all over the place, and the wind just blows it around, and that's part of why, as far as people can tell, there is not very much genetic variability throughout a large part of the range of these things, because the pollen can go for incredible distances. Well, so one of the big issues in these wind-pollinated trees is, well, can pollen be limited? And for a long time, I just, in my typical offhand way, thought, it's not going to be limited. That's not a problem. And, it looks like I may have been totally wrong, as it happens. And this sort of, I won't go into all the details of this either, other than the fact that you can look at these trees, and these are 2 valley oaks on our study site at Hastings, taken back on March 7th, 2005. And what you can see here is that there's just incredible variability. I mean, there's variability almost anywhere when it comes to acorns and oaks, but this is variability in when these trees are leafing out in their phenology. And here this tree is fully leafed out, the catkins are fully expanded, it's presumably producing pollen like crazy, and here 50 feet away you got a tree that hasn't even started yet. And so it became of interest. I mean, it sort of started thinking, okay, well, is there a possible relationship between phenology and why you end up with that relationship I just showed you? I mean, the big question there is, why are conditions in the spring important to determining the acorn crop? Well, presumably it has something to do with the fact that this is when these trees are flowering, and this is when fertilization is taking place. And we don't know a whole lot about that, for reasons which, some of which may be obvious to you and some of which may not be. But so this is my hypothesis that I'm actually working on as we speak, which is that you have local environmental, how homogeneous the conditions are out there. Okay? And what that determines is how synchronous these trees leaf out and flower in the spring. Okay. And how synchronous they are then affects pollen availability. Pollen availability affects fertilization success, and that's what's ultimately determining the acorn crop. Now that's a real nice sort of chart there, and the fact is there are no data to support almost any of it. So I'm just making this up, really. You're wondering where these things come from, but not all of it. And so I just want to mention a couple of things that we do have a little bit of data on and so on. But first of all, why would this work? Well, the idea is that if there's a lot of variability in not only when trees leaf out in the spring, but in how synchronously they leaf out. And what we've discovered over the last few years is that in a good acorn year, or a good year anyway, the trees tend to leaf out really synchronously. Okay, and classically at Hastings, about the 3rd week in March, okay, they begin leafing out at the end of February, beginning of March. About the 3rd week of March, in some years, like 60% of the trees will burst bud. Okay? Whereas in a bad year, like last spring, okay, some of these trees are leafing out at the beginning of March, and some trees aren't leafing out until the end of April. They're just spreading this whole thing out over a period of months. Okay, well, you can imagine that in a really good acorn year, if everybody's sort of leafing out synchronously and producing pollen synchronously, then there's going to be this huge pulse of pollen. Everybody's producing flowers, and there's just going to be a lot of pollen for everybody. Whereas in a bad year, if it's kind of spread out like this, then even those trees that happen to flower when when a few other trees are flowering, there still just isn't that much pollen for their flowers, and maybe that's why nobody ends up doing very well in a good year. All right. So we do actually have a little bit of data to support this, because we have been going out for about the 80 valley oaks that we look at, that we count acorns on every fall at Hastings over the last 6 years now. We've gone out and once a week we go around every one of them and we look at their bud bursts, their phenology. And if you look at the range in their bud bursts, so in other words, we're looking at how synchronously they're flowering in the spring. In years when they're highly synchronous, so the range is very small, we've had 2 such years, and those were the good acorn years. This is now the acorn crop on the y-axis in the fall, whereas the 4 years when they were fairly spread out were years when we didn't end up having very many acorns. Okay, so that at least lends a little bit of credence to this phenology synchrony, kind of leading ultimately to the, being tied to the acorn crop. But why are they synchronous some years and not synchronous other years? Well, we know that if they're warmer, if those trees are warmer, that they tend to flower earlier. Okay, and let's see if I go back here. What we put on every one of our trees is one of these little temperature recorders. This is called an I button. And the I button is patiently sitting there on the north side of every one of our trees, recording the temperature at 4-hour intervals for a year. basically, and then once a year when we go around in the fall to count the acorns, we download all the data, and then we can look at what the temperatures were at that tree. Okay, so this is microclimate at those trees, throughout Hastings, which is, not that huge a place. I mean, we're just talking about trees over a few kilometers, but we're looking at the temperatures at each individual tree. And if we look at the coefficient of variation of the mean maximum temperature in spring, in April, at those trees, when the coefficient of variation is relatively low, so they're relatively homogeneous, those were the 2 good years. That's when phenology was synchronous, and they produced a lot of acorns. And these are the other years. We only have 5 years of data for this. When, in fact, when conditions were colder and wetter, what seems to be happening is that then there's just more variation on a very small scale. And that's what's driving, potentially, this is a hypothesis, that's what's driving the variability in phenology in these trees. Whereas when it's warm and dry out there, it's pretty much warm and dry everywhere. And, you don't have quite as much local variation as you do in years when it's cold and wet out. All right, so I don't know what that was. I think that was something, that was just to say that giving you that list of the little flow chart, giving the hypothesis and basically saying that, well, we do have data for a couple of things. We have data on a little bit of data on how variable the climate is, the microclimate is, how that may be driving variability in phenology, and what we don't have is anything between that and the acorn crop. Though what we've done now is we've put out some pollen traps, and we're actually out there trying to measure how much pollen is there and looking at female flowers to see how often, what happens to them starting now when they're presumably either being fertilized or not, and whether we can actually draw some of the other connections to kind of fill that entire scenario in. Oh, here it is. Okay. Yeah, they're the smiley faces where we actually have a little bit of data. And the pollen availability and fertilization success, which I'm still just making up at the moment. But we're hopeful. And this is sort of my goal for the next few years, is to try to really sort of fill that in so that we, for the first time, really understand the mechanism driving variability in the acorn crop from year to year, something which we just really, amazingly enough, don't know. I mean, all we've known all these years is that there are some of these correlations, and we've never really had any good idea about what was driving them. Yeah?
The question I have is you keep breaking down in either warm and dry, cold and wet. As a coast range, generally when we have the Pineapple Express, it's warm and wet. So my question is, how does rainfall affect that?
Well, okay, so I suppose the answer is I don't know, because when you get too close to the coast, all you have are coast live oaks or, valley oaks. Well, you don't have valley oaks if you're that close to the coast. If you have valley oaks, my guess is...
coast range, like say Sonoma County, Mendocino County, we have lots of valley oaks.
Oh, yeah.
And we have a lot of, not this year so much, but we have a lot of warm rain, Pineapple Express type rain.
I've been here 35 years and I haven't experienced a warm rain yet in California, so I'm not quite sure what you're talking about. But
when you say cold and wet, what do you mean by cold?
Well, in the spring, all winter basically, when it's cold. Well, in the spring, when it's raining, it's colder than when it's not raining. That's what I mean. So, there's a correlation between a wet spring and temperature. But you can look at rainfall too. You still get some, still tend to get that relationship between. The point is that yes, conditions during the spring do tend to be important in this phenomenon, and the best I can tell so far, it does have to do, whether it has to do exactly with the temperature or some combination of temperature and water, rainfall, or not. It could be both. We're still trying to figure that out. I don't think conditions are as different in the Coast Range. I live in the Coast Range, or I lived there for 35 years. I don't think they're that different than what I'm talking about. That's where we're getting most of this, but we can talk more about that later on. Okay. The second thing I wanted to mention, before I've already probably run out of time, is I did want to say a little bit about this larger scale issue of spatial synchrony. Okay, so far I've just been talking about, what makes for a good crop here or a bad crop. Okay, but then we come to this other really interesting issue, which I came upon because we were interested in acorn woodpeckers, and in a really bad year, a lot of the acorn woodpeckers disappeared. And the question was, well, where did they go? Or more accurately, how far away did they have to go to find acorns? If there weren't any acorns at Hastings, did they have to go up to the Bay Area? Did they have to go up here to the Sierras? I mean, where did they go? Is there going to be good acorn? Is there going to be a good acorn crop anywhere? And all right, so this gets to this phenomenon that's called masting. Because see, these are all classic masting species, and what masting is this population phenomenon, whereby you have highly variable and synchronous reproduction. Okay, so we've talked about the highly variable part, but then what about the synchrony? And, it's a population phenomenon. An individual tree doesn't mass, the population of trees mass, by virtue of the fact that they have produced lots of acorns or very few acorns or lots of seeds, few seeds, synchronously from one year to the next. And then the obvious question is, how big a population are we talking about? All right. So we eventually decided to get at this question. And so we, you can do this on a large scale in California, because here's just valley oaks and blue oaks, which of course both pretty much ring the Central Valley. And if you go from way up here in Shasta County or Tehama County, where you get to the northern edge of their range, down here to Los Angeles County, you're talking almost 700 kilometers. So, you can go a long way and ask these questions as to, when it's a good acorn crop down here, is it a good acorn crop up in the north part of the state? And so we now do this. We are now actively engaged in studying this phenomenon in something called the California Acorn Survey, which I'm very proud to say now has its own official magnetic sticker that I get to put on our vehicle. One of which, this was the English version. I also got one in Spanish, which I really kind of like, the Uso Oficial sticker. But and this turns out to be, it takes us 8 days to run around the state. We actually don't run. We drive around the state. Go to about 19 different sites, including Sierra Foothills, which is presumably that one right there. And we have marked trees at all these sites, about 1,000 in all. And we've done this for about 14 years now, and we do 8 species and 50 populations. The goal being really to understand, again, these patterns of acorn production throughout the entire state on a statewide scale. And this is such a big deal. We have our own newsletter, the California Acorn Report, and Doug can tell you all about that later on. Anyway, so the geographic variation in acorn production, a couple of obvious questions over how large an area are they synchronized, what synchronizes them, what are the ecological effects of these pulses, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on this. It's still preliminary. We've only been doing it for 13, 14 years. But here's some data for blue oaks. And so, something I mentioned, question, you don't have any acorns here, can you go 10 miles away and get acorns up on some ridge? Well, we have 10 sites where we count blue oak acorns, from Dye Creek up there in Tehama County down to Libre Mountain, which is down in Los Angeles County, a fabulous place if you've ever been there. And so in the simple way that you do this, okay, now we have the mean acorn crop from these visual surveys that we do from 20, 30 trees at each one of these sites, and we have a mean for each year, and we have that for each one of these sites. So we have 10 sites, and that means you have 9 times 10 divided by 2, 45 pairwise coefficients. Okay, and the correlation coefficients can go from 1 to -1, right? 1 totally synchronized, -1 totally asynchronized. Okay? And each pair, each correlation can do that, and here they all are. So this is all 45 of them, and the important thing here is that none of them are less than 0. Okay, so all of them, and what we're doing here is we're plotting the correlation coefficient on the y-axis versus the distance between the two sites. okay, on the x-axis, going from, around a little less than 100 kilometers for a couple of our sites that are not too far away to nearly 700 kilometers, which is the distance, again, between, up there in Dye Creek down to Libre Mountain. Okay, so the interesting part here is that if you plot a regression through these points, it declines with distance, which is exactly what you expect. In other words, sites that are closer together are more synchronous than sites that are further apart. Okay, if that weren't the case, you'd have to scratch your head and wonder what was going on. Okay, that's exactly what you expect. But the really important part is that there's clear synchrony across the entire state, okay, in terms of blue oak acorn production. When it's a good acorn crop down here in Los Angeles or in the coast ranges, it's probably a good acorn crop up here in the foothills, way up in Northern California as well. Okay, it's not a perfect correlation. There's a lot of, there's a lot of variability. Okay, but on average, they're correlated. Okay, when it's a good year for blue oaks, we're talking about a tree that covers maybe 10 million acres out there, a couple 100 million trees. When it's a good acorn crop, every one of them is pumping out acorns pretty much as well as it can. Okay, which is, as I mentioned, this incredible food pulse for food, for animals, for wildlife out there, which, we really know very little about the effects. Let me just finish. I'm almost done. And the last part of this was just to say that I think what's driving this is, again, spring temperature. I showed you that spring conditions are important to affecting the acorn crop at an individual site. If you make the same kind of spatial map, so here we have distance versus a whole bunch of sites where we have spring, just temperature recorders, just weather stations throughout California, you get a map like that, and if you overlap them, which you can't see very well, basically you can see that the idea is that the spatial synchrony in conditions in the spring are synchronous enough throughout California to potentially be driving the spatial synchrony that we see in the acorn crop. And I think that's probably about it, other than to again mention that they had these things must be having these incredibly strong effects on wildlife. I actually did recently do one analysis here to show that if you look at my first real big result from the California Acorn Survey, beyond the acorns, which is that if you look at the acorn crop, and this is throughout California, just a quick dirty measure based on our survey, and correlate that with the abundance of scrub jays, of western scrub jays, in California based on Christmas bird counts, again, throughout the entire state, you actually get a really good correlation when you lag it by 1 year. So when there's lots of acorns, it means that the scrub jays do very well the next year, and then 2 years down the line, there are a lot of scrub jays out there. And there's one outlier, which 2005, which is, I just mentioned, because that's the year that West Nile virus creamed the corvids in California. And scrub jays were one of those species that got nailed. And so that's why they're presumably so low there. But otherwise, you get a really nice correlation between how much food is out there in the acorn crop and the scrub jays. And with that, I was going to mention a little bit about regeneration, but that's not an issue which we should probably try to squash into the last 15 seconds. And then there it is, the Uso official sticker. And thanks. Yeah?
Just had a question. I don't know if you know the answer to it, but on a heavy acorn year, is there any documentation? There's a widespread difference among cattlemen, whether about acorn toxicity with the cattle, whether it can cause abortions and stuff. Do you have any information on that?
The easy answer to that is no, I do not have any acorn on that. Acorns? I have acorns on the brain. No, I do not have any data on that because I have not done enough analyses of acorn composition to be able to really speak knowledgeably about that.
We'll talk about that in the field.
That's something Doug probably knows about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you have a prediction for the acorn crop this year?
You know, I was driving up here thinking, well, we've done the data, we've done the survey on, you know, phenology. Phenology's pretty much, you know, most of the trees are pretty much leafed out, and I really should have looked at that. My guess is it's going to be a pretty good year, just based on, but I could be wrong. Get a hold of me next fall, and I'll let you know then.
One more question. One more.
Yeah.
When you were looking at those correlations over distance, did you find, like, are there particular trees that, say, in one year don't correlate well, and that they consistently do that, or do you know?
There certainly are some trees which do not.
Is it microclimate kind of things, do you think? Or?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of local factors which can affect things. I mean, you know, I can't tell you how many times that we've had, you know, you come to a place like this and there are just no acorns or something, and, you know, somebody not too far away is talking about how his trees were loaded with acorns, and all I can say is, well, yeah, maybe so, but, you know, on average, it was not a good year. But the other problem is that it's kind of hard to, you know, there's a perception problem with the acorn crop, and that is when it's a really good year, then everything's loaded. If it's a completely terrible year, then, you know, you don't find anything. But most years are not really, really good or terrible. They're somewhere in between. And when they're somewhere in between, it all kind of, you know, it can seem like it's pretty good, but it's not that good. It's just, there are some acorns out there. And so that's why, as I say, it's nice sometimes to actually have data. And I could tell another story about that, but I won't, because I think Doug wants to move on.